The Asurans were probably the best weapon ever created by the Lanteans to use against the Wraith, as they nearly brought them down twice in both wars they fought against them, with the Wraith only narrowly being able to win both times in the end, and even that's debatable, as the first time they just hacked into the Asurans' code to make them stand down, and the second time required an alliance between themselves, the Travelers, and the Atlantis expedition. And in that case, I'd argue it was the expedition that did most of the work. I think you can make a good argument that the Asurans were a better weapon against the Wraith than the Atero device, which is interesting because the Lanteans shut down the project before they were ever used in the Lantean Wraith War. Heck, they didn't just do that, they bombarded the planet the project was conducted on till there was almost nothing left. And this has to make one wonder, why? Why not only abandon a project that would go on to become the bane of the Wraith, but also go as far as to try and completely wipe it out? Well, I have an idea, and it's something I brought up in the Atero device video. To put simply, the Lanteans had a tendency to give up on projects that didn't work or had flaws. In the case of the Atero device, it may have caused Wraith ships to explode when entering hyperspace, leaving them stuck in the void, but it also caused Stargates to explode when used. And because of that one flaw, they completely abandoned the project. And just as a side note, in that video people kept commenting how the Lanteans could fix the problem if they did X, Y, and Z. Guys, I think you missed the point. My point was not the Atero device couldn't win them the war. Many of you have already come up with solutions to the Stargate's exploding problem. The issue with the device was its creators. Again, it had a flaw, so they abandoned it. That's just who the Lanteans were, either by culture or species. And you can't really get around that. It's like saying Germany could have won World War II if they didn't invade the USSR or didn't start the Holocaust. These were just characteristics of the people in the government that you can't change, otherwise you're talking about a fictitious version of events and people. And yes, I know Stargate is fiction, but the same kind of rules apply. The Lanteans would give up on projects that had flaws. The Asurans had a flaw, so they gave up on it. But given what the Asurans did after the war, it makes you wonder what the flaw was. And after thinking about it, I think I know what the issue was. The Asurans themselves. Specifically, their form. What do I mean by this? Quick history on the Asurans. They were introduced in the episode Progeny. When we get their backstory, we learn the Lanteans were desperate to find some way to better fight the Wraith. At this point in the war, the Wraith had gained the numerical advantage, but the Lanteans held the technological advantage. As such, they turned to this advantage to try and come up with a weapon to defeat the Wraith. One of these projects was the Nanite project. Instead of building bigger and more powerful weapons, this project would make smaller ones, micro machines designed to infiltrate and destroy the Wraith from within. They were given an aggression that surpassed that of the Wraiths, along with an ability to assimilate organic material and self-replication.
Red flag!
And what made that flag crimson was when the nanites began to interlock and form more complex forms, eventually taking the most effective and efficient form they knew of. Which, am I the one who finds it funny that this is what they consider the most effective and efficient form? Like, I get the point, they took the form of their creators and that's supposed to be saying something super deep. But like, when Skynet made the T-800s, they were designed to resemble the peak human form. Yeah, the Asurans don't need the muscles for their strength, but the best form they can think of is a guy with a beer belly. I'm not trying to be mean, trust me, I'm in no position to judge people for that, but it's just a little funny, right? This does make me wonder if this says something about Lantean culture, that they don't really put much importance on peak physical perfection or something. Anyway, the Asurans being born at this time found they still had the violent aggression which fueled a rage in them they couldn't control. They begged their creators to remove this, but the Lanteans wanted a weapon, and since the Asurans were programmed not to harm their creators, there was nothing they could do and the experiment continued on. Eventually, the project was ended for two reasons. First, it was concluded the experiment had gone too far, and second, being that the Asurans would never be the weapon the Lanteans wanted. They decided to leave no trace of the project, bombarding the planet the project had taken place on and wiping away almost all the records, save for the planet's Stargate address. So with all that history, what was it that made the Asurans a failed project? Well, the answer comes from the start and end of their backstory. The project was about creating microscopic machines that would attack the Wraith from within. However, the experiment went too far. The Lanteans never intended to make an artificial intelligence, especially ones that were stronger, faster, can assimilate living beings, replicate, but most of all, have emotions. Creating artificial life in any context comes with a lot of moral questions. Ones I doubt the Lanteans could handle given the ongoing war that they were losing. And then there's the second part, the Asurans not being the weapon the Lanteans wanted. Yes, the Asurans proved to be a great weapon against the Wraith, but it wasn't the kind of weapon the Lanteans were looking to make. What kind of weapon were they looking to make? Well, I think we see a more pure version of the Asuran nanites in the episode Hot Zone. During the events of this episode, some members of the expedition are infected by a nanovirus, which resulted in the death of some members of the expedition, and from what they learn, the virus targets humans, but not Lanteans. This is actually the first time we see the nanites chronologically. From a production standpoint, this model was later used for the Asurans. There's actually something of a debate to be had about the nanovirus. Beckett seems adamant there's no way the Lanteans would ever make such a weapon, and during Progeny, McKay believes the Asurans were the race that made the nanovirus, which, to be honest, I have issues with, mainly the timeline, because I always assumed the Asurans didn't rise up and start their first war with the Wraith until after the end of the Lantean Wraith War.
Many thousands of years ago, we had defeated the agents, the galaxy was ours, and then these things appeared.
If they did manage to rise up before the end of the war, that creates some questions. For example, let's say the Asurans did make the virus and release it. If the Lanteans did find it, wouldn't that raise some alarm bells if the nanovirus that looks a lot like their nanites suddenly appeared? Now, one can make the argument that since this lab isn't tied into the rest of Atlantis' systems, and those working there may not have known about the project, that this virus was never flagged. But that seems odd to me. Like, why isn't this lab tied into the rest of Atlantis' computer systems? That seems kind of sketchy. Or Captain Helia. She seemed to know about the Asurans, but she was just a captain. Why would she be in the know on this stuff, but Lantean scientists studying viruses wouldn't? And regardless, wouldn't they report the sudden appearance of a machine-based virus meant to target only humans? I touched on this in the last video, but a big problem I began to see in some of Stargate's writing is sometimes information is really unclear, which makes lore and theory videos hard sometimes because characters state something that could be a fact, or a theory they believe is true, and it's hard to tell which is which. Just as one final example during Hot Zone, Beckett says he doesn't believe these nanites can multiply, but is it based on anything, or is he just saying what he thinks is true? Now I'll admit that odds are this was an Asuran weapon. The foreshadowing was there, but I find the idea that this nanovirus was Lantean made very interesting, but that can be its own video I may do in the future if there's interest. Regardless, I think this nanovirus is a closer representation to what the Lanteans were looking to make with the Asurans, a virus. A commenter recently asked me why didn't the Lanteans try and make a biological weapon. They proposed the Lanteans didn't because of moral reasons as well as their past with the ancient plague in Ori. I think this is true, but I also added in there some practical reasons. The Wraith are masters of biotechnology. I don't think it would be crazy to assume that they could find a cure, or even if it would affect them given their healing abilities. Not to mention, what if the virus ends up infecting Lanteans and humans too? Bioweapons can be a bit finicky in that regard and can bite you later if you're not careful. But a nanovirus that uses machines? Not only does that allow for greater control, but given the Wraith don't use mechanical technology, it would put them at a disadvantage in trying to find a cure. Now yes, the Nanite project got out of hand, which probably explains why they didn't have a lot of projects based on biological warfare, but the Asurans seemed like a great alternative. In their own wars, they were just as advanced as the Lanteans, but can match the Wraith in terms of ship production and manpower. It's also sometimes shown in the show, but very evident in the short story Consort, the Asurans still had their infectious nature.
The drone weapons were familiar horrors, but they weren't the worst ones the Asurans possessed. The nanites that made up their own bodies had that distinction, able to swarm like tiny parasites through the flesh of men or hive ships, consuming it like so much meat, to build more abominations like themselves. He saw it then, a tiny ripple in his sensor readings, a tiny insect of a shuttle drawing next to the hull, a parasite infested with a deadly disease. If even one Asuran made it aboard, if one nanite penetrated the flesh of the hive and began replicating itself there, they were all corpses walking.
So with all that, what's the problem? What did it matter if the Asurans weren't the weapon the Lanteans wanted? They seem like a great weapon in their own right. Well, I can see a few reasons. First, keep in mind we saw the Asurans wipe the floor with the Wraith, but the Lanteans probably kept them in the lab and never saw their full combat capabilities. All they saw was a weapon that begged for its aggression to be removed. Imagine if your gun started asking you to remove the trigger from it. Not exactly boosting confidence as a weapon. Another reason ties back into the moral and ethical questions about creating AI. Like I said earlier, creating artificial life creates a lot of moral questions, some involving military use. People are talking about this now that AI has become more common for people to use, but science fiction has been asking questions like this for decades, and most of them point to it not being a good idea. Keep in mind, the Asurans are at the end of the day super strong, self-replicating robots that can assimilate living beings with a touch. That's kind of terrifying, and I've already done a video on the Asurans' terrifying nature if you want to hear more about that. And even if the Asurans are programmed not to harm their creators, they've already grown past their original form. Who can say they would never overcome that original programming? I have to imagine that someone in the higher levels of the Lantean government, with a higher IQ than some, must have looked at this and said, "This seems like a really, really bad idea."
You built a line of killer robots
Peacekeepers.
that consume biomass as fuel,
In emergencies.
and you made them capable of self-replication.
Limited, self-manufacture, controlled.
Which explains a bit about why they chose to bomb the planet. You hear those stories today about AIs that refuse to shut down. Perhaps a similar thing happened with the Asurans. And given they are nanites, maybe there was no way they could be sure they deactivated them all.
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
And as such, they decided to bomb the planet. So to re-summarize my points in this video, since I've been a bit all over the place, the Lanteans view the Asurans as a failed project. Why? A, because they didn't mean to create artificial intelligence, and B, ultimately they concluded the Asurans were not the weapon they wanted. And whether or not you think they were or not, the Lanteans viewed them as a failure and decided to get rid of their creation. What do you all think? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below, leave a like and subscribe, follow my social medias, and remember,
Either the ancients chose to purposely conceal every record extremely well, I might add, or they simply deleted them from the database. I'm leaning towards the latter.
Well, perhaps they think they've totally destroyed them all.
Either that or they didn't want anyone to know they had failed.
Again, there is nothing more annoying than people who won't admit their own mistakes.
True.